Hugh.
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 Bapu, would you be willing to talk a little bit about your family roots?
Yes. Yeah. The roots are basically Spanish roots, mostly on my mother's side, and then Puerto Rican African roots on my father's side. And they all were involved in Catholic religious worship. On my father's side, my family took care of synagogue. They were the caretakers of synagogue. That's all I can remember. And I used to go in there and play, respecting everything about it. It was a holy place for sure. And then I had on my mother's side a more Catholic, Christian, Orthodox, practice church going and so on and so forth. And as I just said a little bit earlier, I have the roots going back to Django Reinhardt. My Uncle John Corpus was a friend of Django's. When he was in the military during the war, in the army in France, he would seek out Django to hear him play and hang out with him. And he said he was a dear friend of his. And my Uncle John, I remember him, he was a real sweetheart, man. Guy was a sweetheart. Now I know he was critically injured in the war and was considered a hero. So I had a lot of respect for him, but he loved his guitar. I never heard him play much of it, if I ever heard him play anything of it, but he was the guitar man. Okay. And so we have those roots, then we have the Afro-Cuban roots on my father's side, and the spiritualist roots on my father's side. Right. So we had it. I lived in the church. My grandmother's house was a church. And so we had the spiritualist atmosphere of being open to spirits and including spirits in the live stream as not strange, but as part of the norm. See? And that we carry spirits with us, we are spirits, and we're actually more part of spirits than we actually know. See? We don't see it as real, but we're spiritual humans, spirit souls. So that's the basis. And that's where some of my experience comes from in terms of the music. I have a mixture of music. Uncle John into Django music, which is kind of like European music. Jazz, right? And also Latin music. He's Puerto Rican, so he was part of that culture as well. And then the deeper side is with my father, see, but they're all good people. All of them are very good people. Yeah. Great people. Maha-chela.
Yeah, when reading your bio, I remember reading a part where you had an injury to your hand, and I know that has to do with the way that you play guitar. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I had the karma of being with my cousins as a child, 5 years old. We were playing in my mother's house, Carlos's house. And there was a lot of pushing and, you know, and horseplay. And I was accidentally pushed through the yard window. And severed my artery on the glass, the broken glass, the broken part of the window. And so my mother dropped my brother to the floor, seeing the condition I was in at that time, and she picked me up and raced me out of the house in panic, screaming, understandably. I was bleeding. I had the pump going. It was an arterial wound, so it was like coming out in spurts. And so as soon as we got on the street, this is at Columbia Place in Brooklyn, a car pulled up to us, coincidentally, and it was of an army man, a soldier. He says, get in the car, I'll take you to the hospital. It's right down the street a few blocks. And my mother was running me down the hospital, but he saw her and he said, no, he could see how she was in trouble. And I was bleeding like a pump. So this is the beginning of it. So, that's where my guitar career began, with the suffering in my left hand. Right, the pain, the nerve damage of my left hand. So it's always been an issue. It's been constant, lifelong condition of a certain kind of pain, which became a certain kind of healing, and a certain kind of curing of my emotions mixed in with it, and a certain kind of music was created of it. See? So this injuries helped create my feeling and my sound of music as a guitar player. See? So I mean, I can say it's everything because, this is my six-string cross here, and this hand here. It did not always work properly, but in my latter years, a few years ago, the nerve pain disappeared, right? After a lifetime of nerve struggle and pain and difficulty, it's just gone. It's taken away from me. Yeah, hope that helps. And so I did find on the way that there were other players who had a similar injury, comparable, and one is Henry Kaiser. He showed it to me once. So I know I'm not alone, and I feel good about that. That there are others over there who have to play, and they also have to suffer the hand injury in their own right. And I said, oh, that's cool. Yeah, welcome to the club here of wounded left-handers. It's great. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any recollection of the first guitar player that you crossed paths with?
Jazz guitar player. Right. My Uncle John was into Django. He was always talking about Django. So that was a name that I had to reckon with. Django Reinhardt, right? French gypsy guitar player. We are Spanish gypsy blood as well. And so that was Larry Coryell. And I was in the Army when my mother invited me to go hear jazz. She knew I was interested. And so we wound up at the Vanguard in 1965 or 66, where I also met a very, very beloved friend, Rakalam, who was drumming with him at that time. And it seemed like they were kids. And I got it that they were pretty stoned too. They were happy cats. So I did talk to Larry, and Larry coincidentally, and I talked to him about it since then, actually. We had a conversation about it. I said, Larry, the first thing you said to me was when I was at the Vanguard with my mother, and you said I was a great guitar player, right? And I said, man, I was very impressed with that, because I said, no way, I wasn't playing guitar then, I was just a drummer. And then he says in return, he says, Well, back in those days, I was into acid, man, and I was like super psychic. He said, so he can see that he said that. And I said, well, no, it's great of you. And we were supposed to meet after that, but that didn't happen. So he's the first one. Yeah.
Did you have any experiences with other musicians or meeting anybody in particular when you were in the Army?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. A shocking experience. I was in my, I guess you might say, I was living in Frankfurt at the time, in the military, and I think it was a Sunday. It definitely was on the weekend. A fellow trooper came in. We were part of an airborne ranger unit. A fellow trooper came in and said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" I said, "Nothing, I'm just here, hanging out, chilling out, and resting, maybe reading some things." And he said, "Yeah, I'm going to a concert in Hamburg. Why don't you come along, man?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't that interested in concerts," but he got me to join him. He said, "Yeah, no, come on, man. I don't have to go alone, man. We can talk, blah, blah, blah. We're in the same troop, we're friends, we're buddies." So I went with him. And this turned out to be a very catastrophic experience for me, right? Like, it was astonishing. Because that's where I was introduced to the music and presence of Andrei Segovia, the great classical grandmaster of European classical music. Right? So I never heard music like that. So Segovia was, let's say, my teacher of classical guitar music, because I heard it first. I heard Bach, I heard Beethoven, I heard all these master works through Segovia, who was there performing this concert in Germany, and it was shocking. I never heard music like that, but I felt that I knew it, and so yeah, it was a real shock to hear music like that from what I was used to, which was more Latin jazz and Afro-Cuban music. So as the concert ended, there was like a bottleneck going out the front door, and I figured, yeah, let me find another way to get out of here, because I don't want to have to deal with this crowd. I'm airborne, I'm impatient, I'm crazy, I want to jump out of the airplane, and I had to get out of that place. So I went through some of the corridors in this facility, whatever it was, concert area. And then I come upon a room down one of the corridors. The door is open, and I'm walking up to it, and then I looked in, and there was Segovia standing by the window in a small room, and to his left was a bed, and his guitar was on the bed. And I was like, "What is this? Why? What is this?" And he in Spanish said, "Come in. Come in." And he said, "Do you play guitar?" So I was looking at his guitar, out of habit, I guess. And I said, "No, I'm trying to squirm out of that." And he offered his hand. I shook his hand, and we got into a little bit of a Spanish conversation about it. I said, "No, not really." And so it was like, well, it was in this nature. He says, like, "You're a guitar player. That's why you're here." And so that was like a shocking introduction to one of the greatest guitar players who ever lived and ever played like royal music. And he gave me the shock of my life at that point. And so I went on my way stunned with that music, sort of like tingling in my brain, hearing Bach for the first time. And this was an awakening. So this is like a critical moment. See, the thing with Larry was also critical. It was an introduction to jazz, and then the encounter with Segovia. gave me a sense of infinite possibility relative to music, because I heard it all that day in his concert work. So thanks for asking. It's a very powerful time, Hugh.
Yeah, earlier you were talking about your injury to your hand and that experience that you had, and that your mother was taking you.
She saved my life. Right. So she was very, very critically important to me in a number of ways. And so, whereas my father was a drummer, the guitar was prevalent in my mother's side of the family. Right. I had luthier cousins, and my grandfather was a wannabe guitar player. And my Uncle John, talked a lot about guitar, but I didn't really hear much of his playing. I was teaching myself how to play ukulele. I was busy doing that. And so with regard to my mother, I know that she would have to, for her sanity, she would have to go to the church around the corner every morning for prayers. So she was an extremely religious person. She had a condition that a polio condition, which enabled her to feel a lot of pain in her body. So she sympathized with a lot of people who are hurting and broken spirits. She had this affinity with broken spirits, right? And so she was I guess we can say, a devotee of Jesus, and it was a very real thing for her. She saw his pain and suffering. She identified with his pain and suffering. So she had that energy, and so she had very strong emotional influence, right? And a love of music that, second to no one. See? So I know where my roots are relative to her, and my emotional style of playing. And then, I have the drum roots from my father, so the rhythmic thing was there, and then the emotional thing I got from my mother's crying and her suffering, right, which was not fake. It was always genuine and intense. It was intense, emotion, right? And so very, very powerful influence there from her. So I'm going to leave it at that right now.
You mentioned that your father's side of the family was more spiritualist, whereas your mother's...
It was the African side. African, yeah. Not from Puerto Rican side.
Yeah. And that your mother's side was more Christian, is that correct?
Yeah. More European religious presence. And so... you have a question? Yeah, you have a question about that? There's a big difference. Yeah, there's a very big difference. And the Christian influence is very profound. It's very, very strong in my family. And my family were Spanish gypsies. And I guess we can say African gypsies and Puerto Rican gypsies, native gypsies, yeah. But more Spanish gypsies on my mother's side. And so the guitar image and the sound and flamenco were all part of my inheritance. And so I had contact with flamenco people when I was in the army. In fact, I fell asleep on a beach in Spain, and I was awakened by a troupe of people who were singing and dancing on the beach. So I woke up to that, and they asked me to follow them. Right? There's women and guys. So I followed them, and they brought me to a house, and the house was like a large house. where they lived, and they were a troupe of flamenco dancers and singers, and that was really coincidental, because this is new to me, but yet it's in my blood. So there was an awakening of that ancestry factor when I went to hear them play, and I said, "This is not my music, but I relate to it. This is pretty far out music and intense dancing and screaming and playing, and so it was an awakening for me of a sort." So we had that, and then we had Segovia with a more classical mastership, let's say, developments representing the height of classical music, and then gypsy music, and my father was the African music, so there's quite an intense blend there that makes up for the way that I play and how I use my 6-string drum here as part of my message to the people. See? So I'm glad you asked that. Sure.
Yeah, so I know you today as more of a Buddhist, but would you be able to speak about your Christian roots?
Well, I think monasticism is an important thing in my mind and in my practice. I do feel like I am a monastic type, even though I'm worldly. There's no doubt about that. I'm a happy person in the world, in a manner of speaking, but I'm highly disciplined and monastic type, I think. And not to be arrogant about it or proud of it. I just know that I'm a simple person. As my people in the family were simple in their way. They drank, but they smoked, but they were pretty fundamental people in a certain way. They were religious in a practical way. And Jesus was an important figure, to me. I mean, to everybody. He's a profound example of a certain type of monasticism and then sacrifice. He was a living sacrifice. And so, I'm not saying it's worthy of attention to others, but I will say that I find resonance in, let's say, the manner and presence of the president we have, Joe Biden, and I sense him as a devout Christian, as a Catholic monastic in his own right. I get that sense from him. So I respect that. There's a certain kind of ordinariness, but then there's a certain spirit of humility I see, quietness in him, a humbleness that I think is mistaken for like weakness when it's not. To carry Jesus' cross, you have to be strong. See, to carry his burden, to understand Jesus as a human yogi takes inner power to have a recognition like that. So I respect the president. I don't think he's weak at all. I think he's a sharp, good man, right? And I respect where he's coming from, and I think he's been doing a lot of good for this country that may be overlooked, underestimated because of his manner, his style, his age, right? His falls. His what appears to be feebleness at this point, but I know his heart is good. He's talking all the time about helping people, and he's doing it. You got to look at the stats for this guy. And so anyway, this is an important thing that I feel I gained in my inheritance to respect Jesus in the monastics and the suffering that comes with sainthood. Because Jesus is like the father of the saints, and not just Christian saints, but the saints of all the tradition that there are in the world. All the religious traditions have their saints. See, they're exceptionally bright and sacred, like holy people. They have their holy people. See, and they are examples for all of us, because they are inspired. And that's what we're doing here, as humans, learning how to be inspired so that we don't fall and become subject to unnecessary karmic disaster, see, in our lives. All right, so this is, I think, it's something to look at, and I respect all the religions as a result of my upbringing in the Catholic tradition of respecting the saints. So I have to add this, which might cause people some kind of, yikes, and that is the Pope. The Pope's a representative of Jesus' monastic past. I'm not saying he's a good representative, but he has the mantle. He's responsible for executing the teachings and living the life of a monastic in the ways of Jesus, whatever that means to them and to him. See, so I respect that. But a lot of people don't understand it because they're not living to become monastics. They're boring. What, a monastic? No this, no that. Prohibition, say no, that discipline is too extreme, right? But it's part of the spiritual path, which is the most important thing. It's not about being extreme. It's about the spiritual path of renunciation and purification and transcending worldliness to some degree, which is what Buddhism is about in many ways. But it's like being in the world, but not necessarily suffering it. See? Not letting it command you or demand of you to be more the world than what you really are as a spirit. So these are, let's say, items of recognition that I see are also part of my music as a monastic, as a natural monastic, and as a person who respects the path of sainthood or saintliness. Right? I respect it, like the Dalai Lama, who has an aura of goodness to him. He's always laughing. He's a very happy cat. He's not like he's mad. Right? He's high on wisdom. And so this is part of my journey as well. So I'm playing jazz, but I'm also a monastic. Thanks for asking, Q.
Earlier we were talking about your injury and being pushed through a window and having your artery severed in your hand. Do you see any connection in terms of Jesus with that?
Absolutely. I'm not saying anything comparable to what he went through, but it's symbolic to me, for sure. To know what suffering is, to know what death is, to know what giving up your lifeblood is about. Yeah, being very close to death, that's what it was. For me, it was like an awakening. A painful, extremely painful awakening. I remember as a child, I could not sleep. The pain was like overwhelming. I was crying all the time, but that was part of the purification. To know what suffering is about is part of the monastic path. See? And I was lucky that I suffered that much then, because that was grooming me for the guitar unconsciously. See? And I have a certain kind of emotional, almost like painful, melodic emotion that makes some people emotional, right? And I've heard that many times, especially my son Rebbe, cries when he hears some of my melodies, and some people do cry, and they're emotional, So in other words, it's coming from pain. It's coming from real, hard-earned pain and blood giving, see? Dying. I was dying at 5 years old, And my mother saved me from, complete, passing over. And so, yeah, there's a connection there. But it's not comparable to Jesus in a certain way, but there's a connection. We're all here to suffer and pass. See, these are trials we all have to go through. What we make of our suffering has to do with what our sharing and what our offering of grace is to other people. All right? You need to know suffering in order to heal it. Okay? So we inevitably become healers when there's a certain level of suffering that is met, acknowledged, experienced, and transcended altogether. See? And this is what the Buddhist path is about, as, let's say, a doctrine that we have for humans, that there is no suffering. See, that is the reality. There's no suffering. The body's full of pain, but that's not the reality. It's just the body's temporal condition and karma. Okay? So we learn to transcend suffering by suffering and understanding what it is and what it isn't. See? And this is also part of the saintly path of purification, that all of us travel in a certain way, and we all have the same hearts of a saint. We all have the same heart. We all have an urge to be good, to be grateful, to be sympathetic to other people, and to help and heal other people. We all have those urges in us. We don't have to cultivate them to the degree of, let's say, the saints who are here to do that to the extreme, like Mother Teresa flying around her convent, right, off the ground. That levitation requires a lot of spiritual power. It's not fantasy. That's spiritual power. It's a psychic force. These are Christian yogis that can do that. See, and they're called saints because they shed the karmic conditions of the world. They shed it. All they want to do is be in their spirit of devotion, this heart devotion to their Lord, their Savior, their Guru, right? Their saint. See? And then ultimately their own saintlyhood. That's each one of us has that potential. We have that, let's say, potential towards mastering the human condition as well. See? So it's not just music, but we have to master ourselves, right? Our neuroses, our humanness. We have to master that because it's a limitation. See? And that's also like underscored in Buddhism. See? There's nothing more important than peace. Shamatha, right? Peacefulness, healing, goodness, kindness, right? Love and compassion. Shoo. Yeah.
Are there any experiences from your younger years that stand out in particular? Any experiences in there?
You mean of the life and death variety? Yeah, I've had many, and many people have had many close calls. And one that stands out was the one when I was in jump school, when I was jumping, learning how to parachute, fall. And it was a mid-air collision I had with another one of the troops, and it was the wind. The wind had caused this mishap as soon as we left the aircraft, and we were all entangled. And as it was, I was coming down upside down in my parachute. I'm coming down 22 feet per second. And I was commanded from the ground, because we were at school, we were learning how to jump, I was commanded to let this guy's chute go, right, from my neck, because I was upside down and my helmet and my neck were like, you know, heading straight for the ground. It's coming down head first. And I had to let his thing go, right, to save myself by command. I mean, I didn't really know what to do at that point, coming down upside down, wrapped up in somebody's, you know, what do they call them, static lines or whatever it was, you know, parachute lines. And so I had to do that, and then what happened is something happened to him. See, in doing that, something happened to him. And what I remember is hearing him hit the ground. See, and that was a very shocking experience for me. It was a super close call, and I don't know that he made it. Okay, because he fell about 300 feet. I heard him hit the ground. See? So that was very shocking, frightening, awakening. And I continued to jump and loved jumping for 55 more times after that. See? You know, I was never afraid of jumping, but that was a very freaky mishap that I experienced. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Coming down, being choked by another person's parachute, your head coming down head first. Not a good place to be in, but you know, I went through it and I learned from it. That's when it's my time, I'm going to go. When it's somebody else's time, that's when they're going to go. You know, I thought I was going, but it wasn't true. I'm still waiting to go. That's for true. Shoot.
Yeah, you mentioned that meeting Pharaoh Sanders and the Karmapa happened around the same time. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was a profound coincidence that I had access to musical royalty in the case of Pharaoh Sanders, who was Train's protege, one of them, of course. And then I had this experience with the Karmapa, the great Buddha of Tibet during that particular time, in the mid-70s. Probably when he first came over. I wasn't practicing Buddhism then formally, but that was really a profound time for me. See, yeah. Yeah, the coincidence regarding that kind of extremely intense period was relative to my Saturn return cycle, my 30th year. So I had, between the 28th and the 30th year, like a real pregnant time, intense karma having to do with my destiny. So I couldn't create that, I mean. Yeah, so I did this luncheon with the John Tank Quartet, or whatever it was, group, jazz group. And it was Calvin Hill on bass. I don't recall the drummer to speak of. But Calvin said, you know, you have to meet me at the Vanguard. And I didn't know what the Vanguard was at that time in my career. He said, you have to come down because Pharaoh has to hear you. I didn't know who Pharaoh was either. See, this is new to me. I said, Pharaoh. And you know, this was actually Pharaoh, and this was that time. See, this was all the real deal happening to me. So I was being initiated by these profound streams of creative karma. See, I was pulled into it and became a part of it, but I didn't hesitate. See, I did not hesitate. I went with it. I was open to it. And, you know, the rest is history. As far as the Pharaoh musical connection is concerned, was concerned at that time, but now it's as a statement of history, and you know, we played and recorded and done some great things together and became extremely close friends. So he became a brother of mine, and I mean, a real brother. We played like we were real brothers, and I recommend that people listen to the spirit world to get a better sense of the truth of what I'm talking about, you know. It's profound. Phew. So during that time I received the enlightenment, empowerment, initiation from the Karmapa. And I was able to play with Pharaoh, and it wasn't about the guitar. Pharaoh never used me as a guitar player. He used me as a horn player. I was a melodic foil for Pharaoh. I would play what he played, and then we would go from there. So I would respond. It was like a call and response. He'd play something, and I would play it back to him in, you know, in response. And he needed that. It wasn't like playing on it, you know, like it wasn't a game. It was sincere communication, like birds chirping to one another. You know, they hear each other. And you got to let the other bird know that you're safe. You know, you're a positive influence, and you're in resonance with it. You're okay. Mm. See, and there's peace between each other. And so that was the basis for me and Pharaoh, and that's how we played together. I knew Pharaoh. I had an intuition of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said I was, I was his cousin from Nigeria. He said, you're one of my cousins from Nigeria. I would assume that if he didn't know that for himself, then he got it from a psychic person. Something like that. He was told that maybe. Yeah. Who he's playing with is a relative of his. And that's why it felt so good to Pharaoh.